What a pleasure. Thank you all for being here. I guess I will just use words beginning with H. I am honored to be here and humbled to be here, and those two are not getting along so well together. There's sort of a little bit of a conflict there, but actually they're compatible. So I thought we would start off with asking these two extraordinary people to talk about how they got to this subject, if their lives, this will be remarkable because it rarely happens in creative people, but if your lives have been a straight line going direct to this moment, or if there were zigzags and directions that seem to be taking you somewhere else entirely. So if you wouldn't mind starting off with that, of how you got to this.
I was born in Kolkata, and a girl in a Marwari family, which is a community which are sort of factory owners and merchants. And the community is a conservative community. But my parents were Gandhians. My father had gone to jail in the freedom struggle and always wore white homespun, even till this day. So at home, I was learning values of independence and freedom and socialism. And when I would go to school or to the extended community that I belonged to, the messages I was getting was that, you know, girls should not laugh, girls must learn how to cook, and also that the inevitability of my destiny, that I would be married like my school friends. I went to an all-girls school, for many of whom were Marwari too, from the same community. So it was as if I belonged to a shrinking world, whereas at home I was listening to people thinking about the new modern India they were creating. And so I began to try to figure this out. And then I had aunts who would tell me that, no, you've got to cook, but my brother was not being taught how to cook. So I think I understood patriarchy even before I knew the word. And then when I joined a newspaper in Calcutta called The Telegraph, there too I noticed that what affected men was considered political and what affected women was considered cultural. So while I did have a job as a woman and I was given important beats and allowed assignments which were really interesting, at the same time I had to write things from the man's point of view. And I slowly began to insert quotes by women. Even if I covered caste riots, you know, how were they affected, not just as victims, but the world they imagined, or hunger, or poverty, anything that I was writing about. And then, again, as a journalist, I was covering the demolition. I was covering a campaign by a political party in which old monument was destroyed. And there I was nearly strangled to death. And then I went back and testified in the Commission of Inquiry about this. And the questions that I were asked were really sexist. That, are you doing this for publicity? Where are your scratch marks? And even very important political leaders told me girls from good families don't speak about what happened to them. And I understood while replying to them that the shame was not mine, it was theirs, and that's what I said. And so literally through my lived experience, I began to notice the patriarchy, which I had sort of seen around me, I'd questioned, without giving the language. And I began to understand words like gaslighting and trivializing. And in those days, I'm talking about like 1992, 1993, I did not have the vocabulary. And then, in utter disgust from everything which was going on in Delhi, I pushed off to Nepal to just go hiking in the hills when I came across rows of villages with missing girls. And that's when I thought, you know, as a good journalist, I began to ask the question, where are the girls? And I was told they all are in Mumbai. Now, Mumbai was 1,400 kilometers away. And I could not understand how so many girls could be there. So I followed the trail and I found little girls locked up in tiny brothels for years. Some of them were even in cages. I'm talking about 1996. And I was angry, I was sad, I was depressed. but also I was determined to do something about it. So I ended up making a documentary called The Selling of Innocence. I won an Emmy for it, but when I was on stage at the Broadway Marquis Hotel, beyond the bright lights, all I could see were the eyes of the mothers who had broken their silence and told me their story. And so I thought, I'm going to use my Emmy not to build a career in journalism, but to make a difference. And I think something of my own life experience somehow made me connect with the silencing of the women, the dumbing down of the women, the trivializing of the mass exploitation which was happening to them. So I went with them, and together we sat in a circle on a straw mat, and I started an NGO called Apne Aap. And Apne Aap means self-action in Hindi. We also tied in the words women worldwide because we believed in women's solidarity. And that's how I began interrogating patriarchy.
Good heavens. Boy, I want to return at some point to an opening remark you said that girls should not laugh. And there's a reason why I'm grateful for everything you said, but that was sort of one of the key moments of what patriarchy requires, is quit smiling. And don't you dare make fun of me, would be another message there. So just to anticipate something we might come back to, but every part of that is just astounding. And for me as a Western American historian, Lordy, the match between missing and murdered indigenous women's issues in the United States and what you're talking about is really beyond my comprehension and fathoming almost right now. So, okay, so.
And to add to the H's that you were talking about, there's another H, happy.
Well,
and we are not taught to be happy. We are always taught this is your duty, this is what you have to do. And it's so integral to our existence to be happy.
Right. Yes, thank you so much for adding that.
Well, on that, I remember when, on my wedding day, when I was about to get into the car, where you drive away with your husband, and the just married sign on the back, and I was beaming. I was so happy. I'd lived with this man for 5 years already, and we were finally getting married. And my older relatives told me, "You shouldn't be smiling. What are you doing? You're supposed to look upset when you leave your family on your wedding day." And I actually. That was news to me because I had a very different upbringing. My parents were immigrants to the UK, so I grew up in London, but they were very, I didn't realize it at the time, I just thought everybody lived this way, but they gave us, me and my sisters, a very egalitarian upbringing. There were 3 sisters, and we never had the sense ever that there was anything we couldn't do as women, or we weren't even conscious of gender really, because there was no such thing as men's work or women's work in our household. They did everything together, and they still do. After my parents retired, my mum took up another career in social work, and my dad does everything at home, and it's not a thing. We don't even think about that being a special thing that my dad does or remarkable. I would go to other people's houses and I would see the mums in the kitchen and the dads sitting on the sofa reading the paper and be shocked because I just couldn't imagine my dad even asking my mum for a glass of water. He would never imagine asking her for anything that he could do himself. So, I had a very different childhood, I think, from, I've realized later, from the one that many other boys and girls had. And that was one of the reasons I ended up doing engineering at university, was because my dad had been an engineer and I thought, I can do that too. He'd taught me all the DIY. I still do all the DIY at home. I even do it for my in-laws when I go to their house. They save all the DIY projects for me to do when I get there. But it was really then that I started to recognize, racism had been the big defining feature of my growing up, because I grew up in a part of London which at that time was very active for the far right, the fascists. So there would be neo-Nazi rallies. There were a number of racist murders in the area where I grew up. And that was part of the reason why when I got to university, I got involved in anti-racism activism. And then I started writing for the student press, and that's why I became a journalist in the end, to work on that issue of social justice. And I didn't think about, as a science writer, writing about human difference or how we understand race and gender so much as when, these things come to bite you eventually, however you are raised. When I got to, after I had my son, and I had to take whatever work I could get at that point because I'd been out of the game for a year or so. And an editor at a newspaper asked me to write about the menopause, a piece about the menopause, which I didn't know anything about. And at that time, a paper had just been published out of Canada by 3 male scientists arguing that the evolutionary reason why women experience the menopause is because no older women throughout evolutionary history were having sex, which just seemed such a bizarre thing to say. And it was roundly criticized when this paper came out. But it intrigued me because the leading theory about why we lose fertility as we get older, and this also happens to men, it's not as though men don't lose fertility too, they do, but the leading explanation is a grandmother hypothesis, which essentially says that grandmothers are so crucial to the survival of their children and grandchildren that we live as long as we do, even though most other primates die around the same time that they lose fertility. And what was interesting was that a lot of women had worked on the grandmother hypothesis, a lot of men were working on the patriarch hypothesis, and that opened a whole avenue for me to try and understand the ways in which science has been influenced by politics and in turn influences politics. We think of it as a very rational, objective endeavor, and that's what I was taught growing up, but when it comes down to it, when it comes down to research, it really isn't very often, and especially the science of human difference. And that's how I came to write my previous 3 books. But patriarchy in particular as a question came out of my book Inferior, which had a chapter on male domination. So it's very widely assumed sometimes, and I didn't realize how widely, that male domination is just a feature of our species. And of course it isn't. It doesn't go back into the mists of time. It's not universal. And anthropologists, universally, this is an accepted thing now, that patriarchy is an invention of culture and politics and society. And the question that readers would always ask me was, if it hasn't always been this way, then how did it get to this? How did men come to have so much power? And I really didn't have a good answer to that question because, of course, the literature on it is so thin, and so that set me down this path. So this book is a slight departure from my previous work in that it isn't just a work of science journalism, it's a lot of history in there, anthropology and archaeology, just trying to get to the heart of that fundamental question, why does patriarchy exist?
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that. I want to add another H here, which is hope, because what the two of you know in your individual journeys could corrode hope, and maybe has from time to time, but it seems as if you just go back in with the hope, and anyone who thought they could break your spirits is going to have to think something else. Maybe even improve as a human being. That might be something that person could do. So I just am wondering if you could talk about that streak, not streak, it's the core, that hope is in this picture, and also another H, history. And this woman, Angela, makes my people, academic historians, look so wimpy. We just look so timid and so, I don't know, I don't want to say cowardly because I'm not sure we're that, but so not brave. And that's fine. I'm not resenting that at all. It's totally fine. But it is really striking to see how you are just saying, well, okay, origins. We have to get to the origins. Let's go back. And where we would say, well, then we'll go back 7 decades. Oh, no, that's probably too many. We'll go back 6 decades or possibly 6 years. Maybe we'll do that. So your bravery in taking out these big spans of time and not losing your bearings in any way on that. So I'm wondering if you could start, if you could say, we'll talk about the Anatolia archaeological site, speaking of going back more than 6 or 7 decades, and how that shapes grounds, not shapes, but grounds you're thinking about. It doesn't have to be this way, and hope can be in the picture.
You're absolutely right that different disciplines think in different time spans. So historians generally these days will because it's very difficult to interpret history the further back you go, and especially if you go back to the Neolithic, when we don't have writing sources, it's almost impossible. It comes down to speculation. But then there are other disciplines in which that work is done. So archaeology, for instance, anthropology, and now also science, because we have wonderful evidence that has come out over the last decade or so from ancient DNA. So essentially this is the ability to take samples from very old specimens, including Neanderthals, and analyze their DNA and be able to compare their DNA to modern people or people who have lived, which we weren't able to do before. It's incredibly difficult, but what that has allowed us to do is paint patterns, not very clear patterns because we don't have a huge number of samples from around the world, but start to paint a picture of migration, patterns of movement, relationships. We've learned, for instance, through this, that 1 in 200 men in all the world can trace their ancestry back to one man who lived in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago. And scientists think that this man may have been Genghis Khan, Temujin. And the reason they say this is because Genghis Khan is one of those clear patriarchs that we can identify in history. Here is someone who had something like 23 official wives, hundreds of concubines, so many, many children. And he also passed on that legacy to his own sons and grandsons. So his sons also had more children than the average man. And I think that, you know, that skewed, lopsided power balance that reflects itself in the genetic record and how many children people have had is important to remember, because one of the linchpins we have to understand of patriarchal power is not that all men have power over all women, it's that an elite of men have power over pretty much everybody else. And how this emerged, I mean, we'll come to that later, but just to remind you that it hasn't always been this way, one of the first places I visited for research when I was writing this book was Çatalhöyük. So, like you say, you have to go right back to the beginning. Where's the very earliest place that we can go from which we have any evidence? This is a site that dates from at least 7,400 BCE. So this is more than 9,000 years. To put that into context, that is 5,000 years before the first pyramids went up in Egypt. It predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. It predates writing. When it was excavated in the 1960s, it was described in architecture journals as the first city in the world because it was just so remarkable. When you get to that site, you know, and it hasn't all been excavated, we only have a portion of it, but you see this huge cavern and it looks almost like lots of boxes piled up on top of each other, and that's because instead of having doors and windows, people would come in and out of their houses through a hole in the roof, and there would be a ladder, and then they would conduct their business on the top of their building. So every house was jammed up against every other house, and new homes were built on top of old ones. So every stage of that settlement is another generation. And we can tell a lot, even without written evidence. We have beautiful frescoes, we have figurines. We can tell a lot from burial patterns, human remains, about gender inequality. So what was the relationship between men and women? What kind of work were they doing? Every single measure we have of gender inequality tells us that in Çatalhöyük, this site in southern Anatolia, so this is in modern-day Turkey near the border with Syria, 9,000 years ago, men and women lived pretty much the same lives. They ate the same food, they did the same kind of work, they spent around the same amount of time indoors and outdoors. Even the height difference between men and women was slight. And I think that's important to remember because often we look at differences, sex differences, something that is fixed. But actually, the way we look now, any differences you can see between gender now is as much a product of how we've made ourselves as it is of anything else. That's not to say that there aren't biological differences between sexes, of course there are, but we emphasize that through diet and the way we dress and so many other things. You know, how much we eat. There are parts of the world, and Ruchira, you'll know, in which women don't get as much to eat as the men. They're not given access to the same amount of food. So in this site, we know that men and women lived pretty much the same lives. There's no sign of gender inequality here. And there's no sense either that women are invisible, because we have so many female figurines from that period of time, so many. The most famous of which is the seated woman of Çatalhöyük, which I was privileged to see, and I almost broke down. It's such a beautiful object, about as high as my hand. It depicts this older woman sitting completely, her back bolt straight, upright, these rolls of fat spilling out around her, these deep indentations in her skin, which indicates maybe her age. And underneath her resting, so her hands are out like this, next to her, and underneath her resting hands are what look to be two big cats, possibly leopards, staring straight ahead, as though she's tamed them. Now, when she was first discovered, the seated woman, she was described as a great goddess. So the archaeologist James Mellart, who did the original excavations in the 1960s, he's passed away since then, described her as a great goddess. More recently, archaeologists have suggested that maybe she was a real person, because this is such a naturalistic figurine. She looks so real. But either way, you know, what this depicts is a society in which perhaps gender mattered, but it certainly didn't matter to the way that people lived. And possibly there were important women who lived here. So then the big question for us becomes, if we know that's what it was like 9,000 years ago in that region, the wider region is the Fertile Crescent, then when and how did things change?
Stay tuned. We'll be back on that. So, Ruchira, you were thinking you would like to read a passage from the book, and I would like to do a little prelude on that we have an amazing, I'm not going to call it a social psychology experiment, because that would be not respectful, or maybe it would be, but we have the genres that would be most likely to awaken the indifferent or oblivious. They're represented here. We have nonfiction, writing and journalism. We have documentary making, visual and sound, and all the ways in which I think people's defenses can be just scrambled by that. And then we also have a novel, because you wrote novels. So we have fiction, nonfiction, documentary. We've seem to have overlooked having a musician, but maybe there's some talent. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if you were both really gifted musicians as well. So no, apparently not. Okay. Well, and it's not. Don't look at me, because that's not going to happen here either. But anyway, so if you so shifting to that framework a little bit about the different forms of reaching people who would be otherwise maybe pretty determined not to be reached, and how these different forms of communication and entrancing stories about archaeology, that a person could read that without any intention to reach this conclusion. The person will have to at least visit at that time. So anyway, I'd like to talk a little bit about those genres, but I'd like to have that passage from the novel here, just in terms of this hope theme and what that means.
I'm going to read a passage from my young adult novel. It's called I Kick and I Fly, and it's based on true life experiences that I witnessed or actually saw what girls did in my NGO. I began writing this book when a young girl who was from what is now called a denotified tribe, and the British, when they had colonized India, had called a criminal tribe, which was basically nomadic groups who were banned from either living in the forests or from moving from one place to another, or even making indigenous medicine or other products. And they had to become squatters on government land and zamindari land, and they ended up with intergenerational prostitution. So when India became independent, we removed the law, but the stigma and the discrimination remained in such communities, and they're still trapped in intergenerational prostitution. So my work in Apne Aap is actually located among such communities, and what I try to do is dismantle the system of oppression and patriarchy by addressing basic needs and questioning the system girl by girl and law by law. So this is based on a true story. I began writing it when a girl in my NGO actually won a gold medal in karate. But how did that happen? And how did these girls ever, through the 20 years of my NGO, stay in school, finish school, and are now graduates with jobs? How did it all happen? People keep asking me. So here's a little passage to say how we can challenge patriarchy, and in very real terms. So my character is a protagonist. Her name is Hira, which means diamond. She's 14 years old, and she's from the nut community. And this is in a strip called Girls Bazaar in a small town called Forbisganj in Bihar, one of the poorest parts of India. So Hira asks her cousin, who's already been sold into prostitution, a question. She says, what if everyone in Girls Bazaar, Chacha and Baba are right? Did Chotu, my little sister, die because of me? What if I did bring bad luck to the family? I voice my doubts aloud. This grabs Miradi's attention. Since when did you begin to believe in this superstitious nonsense? I don't meet her eyes, focusing instead on Jamila Bua as she fries the onion fritters for the lunchtime rush. A black crow drives a sparrow away from the garbage. It's a stark reminder that the mightiest will survive, that destiny decides who will be mighty. It's the way of the world, Miradi. If destiny hasn't decided where I was born, who has? It's all a birth lottery, I say bitterly, walking up and down inside the small space of our shack. Miradi comes and hugs me. She strokes my head. I know you feel frustrated, but do you have a choice? What else can you do? I steer the conversation away from destiny. In my heart, I know that I don't believe the superstitions. All the women in our lane believe in the eternal, inescapable fate of our nomadic nut tribe because they can't imagine anything beyond it. There was no defiant mother or cousin or sister to fight for them. I decide to spell out my other fear. What if I don't understand anything in school? There, I've said it. I don't want to be the stupidest kid in the class anymore, especially knowing what the boys will do to me. She looks at me with no expression on her face. Then her brow furrows into a small fold. As far as I remember, you did fine in school, at least when you were a kid. You used to get the highest scores for reading, both in Hindi and English. You used to be so fond of books. I could not tear you away from the school library. She smiles at the memory. I smile back. I used to love the dusty library, the smell of books and the stories I read in the privacy of the desk between the shelves by the window. Rabindranath Tagore, Sharat Chandra, Mahadevi Verma, and the adventure stories by the English writers, Enid Blyton and Laura Lee Hope. Words had always come easily to me. Then came the hunger, the bullying, the chores at home, my first menstruation. Everything slipped away. I did well because you and my brother Salman would help me when I got stuck. Then ask Salman to help you, Miradi suggests. He's so busy with his own studies, I mutter. Can't you help me? Do you think I remember anything after the hell I've lived through these past few years? There's an aggressive edge to Miradi's voice. I see a small, warm spark of hope fight the fear in her eyes. She wants to convince me to go to school against all the odds I must face. Under her clumsy makeup is a desperate appeal. I look at her and remember her full-throated laugh, happy laugh as a girl. I resolve to rekindle the laughter, light, and hope in her eyes. I will overcome my fears for her. I will fight for my future, for the dreams that she could never make come true for herself. Outside, the sky is gray, the sun sending out weak rays through the mist. Far off, a train whistle blows. I give Miradi's hand a squeeze. I promise I will try and go to school. I want to anyway. Miradi finally smiles. She gets up to go. She can't stay too long in case Chacha or Shaukat start looking for her as soon as a new customer, client appears. Okay, so I know you will go to school tomorrow, she says, as she ties a scarf around her head. Her body language changes. She stiffens, drawing in her shoulders as she walks away. Selfishly, perhaps, I realize as I see her go that I'm not doing this just for her. I want to be a person. I want to kick and fly. I want to win. I want to have the courage to demand a life without fear.
I think I'm going to retreat on my divisions among genres because they're seeming quite intertwined, because that is written from real life observation and then put in a form where we have a character who is going to end up in a desperate situation. She is on her way to captivity and sexual trafficking. So we have her, but then we get to know her individually in ways that fiction. So, okay, forget my stupid question about dividing up the genres and what fiction can do, unless you have anything you'd like to say about it. Have you got a novel waiting to happen, Angela? No, no.
Absolutely not.
Oh, well, then let's go on to another topic, shall we, on that one. So I'm wondering if we could go to that, well, we've already got it, really, the fatalism treatment program. Getting over fatalism and thinking this is just the way things are, and to further that exploration of how you both administer that to people in need, and maybe also people didn't even know they were in need of getting out of that. Could you take us where we had a little bit of cliffhanger there when we got the origins, and we knew that the origins were not intrinsic to human character from the archaeological studies and other matters, and then you were going to get to the how it became normal, how it got to be considered this is the way human beings are, with people writing that explicitly, with some of the people you cite as your predecessors just saying that's what human beings do. Yeah. Well, take that on.
And there's strains of that also in Ruchira's work, that you can see this fatalism, this sense that, well, there is no other way that my life is ever going to be any different. And there is that in the way that we think about inequality as well. You know, we become resigned to it. And I think patriarchy in particular, gender depression, is one of these remarkable forms of oppression that we really do. It's so widespread, this assumption that it has always been there, that women have always been oppressed by men in some way, when actually we've known for a very long time that the evidence doesn't point in that direction at all. Even towards a division of labour, like I said, and Çatalhöyük isn't the only example. So for instance, and just also to highlight what you're saying about the way that we read the evidence and how we impose our assumptions upon it. So for instance, in 2018, archaeologists discovered in Peru, in the Andes, and again, this is 9,000 years ago, an individual was buried. They were between 17 and 19 years old when they died, and they were buried with 24 stone implements, which included projectile points, knives, so very clearly what archaeologists call a hunting toolkit. So this person was categorized as a hunter, until it turned out from analysis that the remains were female, so the skeleton was female. And then there was this kind of surprise that rippled through the archaeological community, to the point where one male archaeologist, older male archaeologist, told National Geographic magazine, "You can't just stop in the middle of in the middle of hunting a deer to nurse a crying baby." So what he's essentially saying is that at no point in the whole of human history have young women ever done anything other than nurse crying babies. That's all we've ever done. Which flies in the face not just of all the evidence we have of women hunters and gatherers all throughout the world, and women warriors. We have a huge literature on women warriors and women rulers on every single continent. But it also betrays what is the kernel of the narrative, this narrative that has always been present within the sciences, that patriarchy is somehow normal. It's always been there, that we're like chimpanzees. We're naturally male-dominated. There has been, even in feminist literature, there's often this kind of putative assumption that when we introduce gender equality, we're doing something brand new. This has never been done before. We're rewriting everything, which isn't true at all, obviously. So, there have been explanations made. In the middle of the 19th century, this became a big question. And some people have said, well, if it hasn't been around forever, then it was a product of civilization. That as soon as you get modern societies, you get this. As soon as you have agriculture or property, Many of you will have heard this. In socialist literature, people will say that property was when men started to control women's sexual freedom. And again, the historical evidence doesn't tally up to that. That's not to say that more evidence won't come around one day and rewrite this story. But just based on what we have now, this is what good scientists are supposed to do, based on the evidence that we have now, what can we infer? What kind of narrative can we start to draw? And what that evidence tells us is that we had agriculture for a very long time before we see any signs in the historical record of gender depression. Where we really do start to see a turning point is with the rise of the earliest states. So this is between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, when the big first states were emerging in regions like ancient Mesopotamia. So again, this is a region similar to where Çatalhöyük was. And what concerned the social elites in those early states, the people who were trying to produce these states, and they included men and women at that point, was how do we get people to come and live in our states? Because just imagine, this is hard for us to imagine now because, the whole world is divided up and you're born a citizen and you stay that way. But at that time, you could quite easily leave. You could go and be a hunter-gatherer or go and live somewhere else. You didn't have to stay in a state. But the elites needed people to stay, produce a surplus for those at the top, and defend the state, if necessary, against any outside attack. So inevitably, those in charge became concerned with what happened in the family because they were worried about population. How do we get people? That was the fundamental concern of those early states. The anthropologist James Scott writes in his work very beautifully about, it's always population, population. How do we get people to work for us, stay for us, be loyal to us? So over time, what you see, and this happens very gradually over thousands of years, in the beginning, you see women all over the historical record, doing everything. Later, they disappear because, this is one of the things I argue, is that pressure begins to fall on young women to have as many children as possible, and pressure starts to fall on young men because they can't have those children to fight and defend the state. So those two twin concerns, you can see how all our kind of ideas about gender emerged from that first preoccupation of those early states. And it remains that way now. Birth rates and defense are still the two most important things to states now. I just wrote a piece for the Financial Times about this recently, because in Russia, which has really become the archetypal patriarchal state under Putin. Putin is this patriarchal figurehead now for misogynists all over the world. But you can see, because of the war in Ukraine, they've got a shortage of young men to fight. So a year ago, the government introduced a mother heroine medal. So this is for women who have more than 10 kids are essentially given a state honor, this mother heroine medal. Because essentially this is saying you are doing your duty to the state. You are doing your job for the state as a woman if you have as many children as possible. And meanwhile, just recently, because all these young men are fleeing conscription, they don't want to fight in the war. Loads of young Russian men do not want to fight. And again, the patriarchal state doesn't care if you want to have kids or don't want to fight. You have to do it because that's what the patriarchal state demands. So the Russian government released an advertising campaign that said, "Be a man." If you want to be a man, then you have to enlist and be part of the war effort. So even to this day, those twin gendered concerns of the patriarchal state continue to shape how we organize ourselves and how states operate.
And in your book, there's the book that is called The Book. But in your book, you do talk about the origins, communist ideology, about a better move towards women's equality. And so they are violating many of their own heritage as if that would matter to Putin. So let that go. So I just want two quick questions. Building on your statement about how it is the elite men who benefit from patriarchy. It is not that all men exert massive amounts of power over anything. Women are anyone else. So is there a way to think about this as so systemic, and that the great majority of males are not particularly, they're not direct beneficiaries of this necessarily. Maybe there's collateral benefits, but just, I guess I'm just wondering, is there a way of addressing, I mean, men, the U.S. military has some similar qualities of this is, you'll do this because you're going to be a man. So how can we free men from manipulation? Ho, ho, ho. So I'm just thinking that there's got to be something that could be empathy for the majority of men who are in a system, and systems will obscure individual choice and so on. And then I'm also wondering, back to this thing, that maybe humor could be part of it, because it is really silly for working class men to support the privilege of elite men.
Yeah, but they do. I mean, you see that all over the world. This is what populist leaders are all about, is they're defending the interests of the elite while pretending that they're defending the working classes and everyday people. But we become invested in these systems of power because we hope that our proximity to it will give us some benefits. And that's essentially what patriarchy does to a lot of people, is that it doesn't give you everything, but it gives you something. It gives you power within the home, for instance. It gives a man power within his home. It gives a son, the status in society. So it does things for people. And also, we have to remember for women as well, if you look at figures, women throughout history who have supported patriarchal systems, it is because they gain benefits from that proximity to power, whatever that is, or supporting it.
Dark humor, bitter humor might help with that, who knows? So how does this whole line of thought play in your just hands-on direct engagement with human beings? Is this too abstract to think about?
No, it's absolutely everything that Angela said resonated. And including, the fact that we think some things are inevitable, like patriarchy. In my own work, all the time I keep being told, oh, prostitution is the oldest oppression, or men will be men. And I keep trying to challenge that by saying it could not have been the oldest occupation, because there must have been hunting, there must have been farming, people had to live first, and it could be the oldest oppression. And the fact that people say men will be men is sort of an insult to most men that I know, because they don't want to go around buying women and commodifying them, but they have been told that this is the way. And the messaging, that be a man, and then you have to do this or do that. If you're in the corporate world, if you're a salesperson, you have to attend parties where girls are actually put forward for sale. So these kind of things create a culture in which most men are uncomfortable, but they have to fit in. And the same thing with women. And I was just talking to Angela and Patricia this morning, and we were talking about the fact that where do we first experience hierarchy, which sort of normalizes patriarchy for us? It's at home, because from the time that we are born is when we realize that it's all right for one class of human beings to order and one to obey. And there's a head of the family who will take decisions right or wrong. And so what gender does is it digs a trench into our brain into which all hierarchies fall. It's the first hierarchy we experience. So then when we go out into the world, we accept the hierarchy of race, we accept the hierarchy of caste, we even begin to vote in a head of the state, who's very much like the head of the family. And, Hitler actually used this when he was campaigning. So when he was campaigning in Germany, after the Germans had lost the First World War, he told the Germans that, you lost control of your family during the Weimar Republic, because the women were very emancipated then, in that time in the period of history across the world. They had childcare, they were getting into parliament, they had jobs, they were cutting their hair short, their dress was becoming shorter, they didn't have to fumble around with lots of clothes. And he said that I will restore your masculinity by giving you control of the family, the Kinder, the Kirche, and the kitchen. And this resonated with many Germans who voted him into power. And exactly what Angela was saying, that, he began to demand that the not upper caste, but Aryan women would have more children to build the Aryan race. And so many women would go around saying, I'm having my fourth child for the Führer. And so we are seeing things replicated again now in history, the normalization of violence, the normalization of patriarchy, straight from the family to the state structure, and the rise of the authoritarian leader.
And also, sorry, I was just going to say that the abortion debate, not just in this country, but in countries like Poland, we have completely divorced it from this question of birth rates and population and patriarchy, or not so much patriarchy, but we associate it with religion. It is why does the state care at all about how many children you have? Why does it bother them? The only reason that abortion is the big state concern or political topic that it is because of this fundamental concern about birth rates. However much it's become intertwined with other things later. The very first modern state to legalize abortion was the Soviet Union in 1920. And the reason it did it was because Lenin, under his original aims for the Soviet state, was to emancipate women. And there were a lot of illegal abortions happening at that time. Women were dying in large numbers, so they legalized abortion for their sake. Stalin, when he came into power, noticed that birth rates were falling, and he made it illegal again. And we completely forget that little bit of history now when we talk about abortion.
Interesting. So we have 10 minutes for questions. We have 12 minutes. 11.5. So, yes, and there's a question.
Given that I feel that we are regressing because of the illegal abortion issue, and all around the world, actually, it seems there's more patriarchy. Do you see any hope for the future?
I see hope because I succeed girl by girl in the most entrenched systems of patriarchy, red light districts, and among tribes who have suffered from patriarchy through colonialism and, of course, sexism down hundreds of years. And even there, we've been able to uproot it. And the way we have been able to uproot it is through collective action, and that's what I describe in my book. The power of a community coming together and challenging something that they care about. And in my book, of course, it's women's collective action. So that's where the hope lies, that communities have to come together at the grassroots. Nothing is going to come from the top. And we can't wait for a savior to come and change things for us. We have to do it ourselves. And the hope is there, because I've been traveling up and down America and the world, actually, with my book this year. And I've been meeting communities who've been challenging systems of power, hierarchy, gender, race, sex, all kinds of things, caste. And it's literally at the grassroots by them coming together and taking action. Even to send a girl to school becomes a challenge to patriarchy. So that's where the hope is.
And also I would add that I wouldn't see it so much as a regression as, because of course it hasn't always been this. It wasn't as though patriarchy was the original condition. This is something we invented and we built up over time. So even 1,000 years ago, there was much more variation in gender roles and the way that states organize themselves than there is now. So I would see it as it's just being reinvented and repackaged for now. This is patriarchy for the 21st century. It's not kind of an inevitable backslide or anything. And I'll just say there's only one illustration in this book, and we didn't get a big chance to talk about this, but it is, sorry, I'll just quickly show you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It is, but that also remember that we might be facing a backlash, because we are freer. And the fact is that, think about this. Like, I'll give you a very specific example. Domestic violence was considered private life. Now it's considered crime. So there are things which have changed quite a lot, the vote and, other things, which we forget. So maybe we are facing a backlash right now, which is the most vicious for a long time. And we have to just keep at it, because if we give up now, we've lost all the gains we've made, and we might even go further back to what was possibly medieval times or something.
But I was just going to say, so there's only one illustration here. This is a map of existing matrilineal societies in the world, and there's more than 160 of them that anthropologists have documented. The reason I bring that up is because we assume that patriarchy is now universal, and it really isn't. There are very many places around the world in which the patriarchal family just doesn't exist as a social construction. And in those societies, the gender norms, the way that things are organized, the status of women and girls is completely different. Health outcomes, everything, educational outcomes are completely different. And every single one is different. Every matrilineal society is different. North America is home to many of them, many of these matrilineal societies. The reason that patriarchy feels so homogeneous and it feels so widespread is because it was systematically exported as a form of control over people, not just by European empires, but by empires that came before that, the Mongols, Greeks, Romans, many others. And they all, what it presented to them was the same benefits that aristocracy or caste or race oppression offer to societies, which is creating groups of people that will work for free, that will, that will produce more children than you would normally have, labor that is available that wouldn't otherwise be available. And that's why states have seized on it. That's why it has become so widespread. But it is a weird way of organizing things. There is nothing normal about it. We talk about backslide, but we have to remember that why do we feel so uncomfortable in these patriarchal societies? Why are we railing against it so much? It's because we know deep down it's unfair. And, as scientists will often write about, what is our nature deep down? Is there some kind of basic violence that is part of our nature? Are we naturally status-seeking, hateful? Do we, xenophobic? And those may well be aspects of who we are as humans, but also we very keenly feel injustice. Even young children, toddlers, if you, treat a child unfairly, they will react immediately. They will feel it as a burning pain, that sense of injustice. So that is also part of our nature. So this system that we're in is not anything that we should feel resigned to. And the big pushback and the push the other way, which will always happen, human conflict is part of who we are, I think is a product of the fact that we hate injustice so much.
I have just one quick comment to add that complacency is a very dangerous mental susceptibility. And I think that might be what's at work here, that certain things were just, well, now we're through with that, we were complacent about that. And as soon as complacency is in the picture, well, the cheerful part of that is that when complacency gets rattled, people come to life. So just always be on medical alert for complacency, and we'll all be in better social health, possibly with that. Oh, goodness gracious, so many questions. So you said back there, good.
Hi. My question is to Angela. I keep hearing that there are inherent gender differences between young kids, even when young girls may be more caring or community-oriented. And as a student of gender and politics, it somehow doesn't sit well with me, but I haven't researched enough to have a counter. So I was just curious, from your research, if you have come across any research on whether there are gender differences between infants and toddlers? Thanks.
That was the subject of my 2017 book, Inferior, and it was quite exhaustive, the work I had to do for that, because you're right, there are these very deep-seated ideas we have about sex differences between young children, but genuinely, the only study that has ever been done, for example, on newborns, looking at whether newborns behave differently based on their sex, was later shown to be completely flawed. And in fact, it was the researcher who did that study that told me herself that she knew that there was bias creeping into that study while she was doing it, but she didn't have a choice because her supervisor was so insistent that she carry on with it. Male supervisor, I should add. So we have to be very careful, I think, when studies come along making these claims. We don't see, genuinely, on psychological testing, we don't see statistically significant differences between even men and women, so not even between boys and girls, but even between men and women, even on measures like spatial awareness, which, often people will say that, men have better spatial awareness than women. I remember my boyfriend at university trying to tell me that. He was a chemistry student. I was an engineer, and he was trying to tell me that. So we genuinely don't have the data for that. A lot of what we imagine to be deep-seated difference is a product of how we raise our kids. And that begins right at the beginning. I'm so suspicious of this trend towards gender reveal parties, which I just think is terrible, because it's essentially imposing stereotypes already. What does it matter if you have a boy or girl? Why does it matter to you? The reason it matters is because you imagine what they're going to be like based on the stereotypes you have about boys and girls. We need to be able to rid ourselves of that. It's not easy. I'm the mother of a 10-year-old boy. It's not easy to just let our children be themselves because we want them to fit in. We want them to, if they're boys, play football. We want them, if they're girls, to go and dress up like princesses with the other girls. But just let your kids be themselves. You'll be surprised how different and unique every single child is.
So we can have one more.
Ruchira? In your book, your characters talked about how hunger makes us forget our choices and our hope. And that came out right as we moved from hope in history to fatalism very quickly. So I wanted to ask, that's also ironic because women in the patriarchy find themselves in the kitchen. So I wanted to ask, what do you think we do about consumption, feeding our bodies, and fighting patriarchy?
It's so essential, actually, the power of our body. And that's why, you've seen that how the women's rights advocate who's trying to help Hira get back into school, she begins by enrolling her in a Kung Fu program, because through the practice of Kung Fu, Hira discovers the power of her body and learns to fight for it. There's a line in the book where she says that self-defense taught me that I have a self worth defending. And this is the same girl, who I was writing about, that she doesn't want to go back to school because she thinks the boys will bully her, and of course, she won't do well in class, she can't concentrate, doesn't understand anything. But here is something she can excel at. But to do that, she needs food. And hunger is such a prevalent thing in my story. And in India now, 21 million people have just slid below the poverty line in the last 4 years alone, which no one talks about. And many food programs have been dismantled. We know in America also, you keep reading data now, that hunger is increasing in America. And of course, if there is patriarchy and there is son preference, then who gets more food? It's the boy. And that, Angela referred to it, that look at the difference between the height of men and the height of women in terms of, we are becoming more anemic, we are stunting, and this is really true more so in India than even here. So there's, of course, a connection between patriarchy and what we eat and our nutrition levels, and how it impacts on everything which happens in our life as we go along.
Well, we seem to be out of time. My little, I don't know if they're worth even bothering with, but my efforts to say that humor and mockery and satire might be of use has caused me to realize that patriarchy and malarkey rhyme. And a limerick is totally waiting to happen there, which sadly I didn't think of ahead of time, but I might be back with the humor could really loosen this up in some ways. I had written in my notes here that we will see at this session the many insights delivered by thinking about patriarchy with an international perspective and with the context of deeper time. Boy, did I get that right. I wrote this before I met these people. So I have a new line of work as a prophet and predictor, because I just called that exactly. Not a surprise, I knew your work. But anyway, I would like to have you all join me in thanking these extraordinary people. And one way to put that gratitude into action is to go to the book signing and buy a book and then get to spend more time with them in the privacy of your own home or in public places or wherever. So do go to the book area and book selling area and get some books. So thank you.